Hello and welcome to today's webinar, B.I.G, a framework for constructing and maintaining trauma-informed classrooms. My name is Tara and I'm joined by our presenter and our other NYU team member, Dr. Kirk J. James. Before we begin, I want to cover a few logistics. As we've done in the past, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted along with the slides in the next few days. We will also be taking questions throughout the webinar and have time at the end to set aside to address these questions. As such, we ask you to chat in your questions to all participants using the chat box functionality. With that, I want to thank you all for joining us and hand it over to Jay to get started.
Thank you, Tara. I'm so happy to be doing this. The slide that you actually see is the umbrella that I work under, which I'm going to discuss a little bit more. And if you look at the words evolve, you will see the words love. It's the white letters. So if you look again at the words evolve, you will see the word love. So I am so happy to be here today. There's so many things I'm feeling. It feels almost like a solo act, right? Like after, having this amazing experience with my NYU Silver colleagues, in collaboration with amazing folks in California. Just really having those conversations around how we can better support folks in prison around like education. I mean, that has been honestly one of the best experiences of my life. So I'm very happy to just really share my knowledge, share my experience in relation to this. And the framework that I'll be speaking about today, it's a framework really rooted in my work, right? My work not only with incarcerated folks, but my work in educational institutions like NYU, like Columbia, like the University of Pennsylvania, like City College, places where, again, we have people that are coming from spaces of trauma, and we need to definitely rethink our educational process or praxis with greater intentionality. So thank you. Excited to be here again. Peace. It's how I usually like to start conversations. My name is Kirk James, and if you notice the word J, that is probably another webinar in itself, but yet it's just really my acknowledgement of my work around anti-oppressive practices and how that plays out even in my name. And for folks that I think a really great reference point that I often tell people when they think about names, right, specifically names of folks who are quote unquote African American or folks in the diaspora, is to go back to Roots. If you haven't seen Roots, there is a really great scene that really just highlights that. Again, I'm a professor at NYU Silver School of Social Work. A lot of my work historically has been around issues of mass incarceration. My dissertation, part of my dissertation was actually around the history of prisons, right? Prisons are a thing that most people just think are, universal, axiomatic. They've been here forever. Yet I really wanted to push the conversations of like why prisons exist and how they function in their existence. A lot of my work, again, is really looking at what I would say is systemic injustice and looking at the impact of trauma within those systems. Also looking at what fosters healing and resilience, like maybe three themes that we have interwoven in this conversation of education, because I feel that they're things that go hand in hand. And ultimately, for me, this work is about human rights, like really reconceptualizing what it means to be human in a way that it is inclusive of everyone. For folks that are social media inclined, I've been resistant to social media for so long, but I realize it's essentially the way that we exchange cards now. So you can find me on Twitter at DocJ75. So I start by really putting this quote here, right? And I'm going to put it here for a second. And it says that education can only be liberatory when everyone claims knowledge as a field in which we all labor. And it's a quote by Bell Hooks, someone who has been instrumental for me in how I think about education. For me, though, this quote really symbolizes what we hopefully have tried to do as a collective, and it's to really enforce that learning, education, knowledge can only really be cultivated in a community. And I think we've talked about community of practice a lot, but really haven't emphasized community. So this is me really acknowledging that there is immense, knowledge that is on the phone, that are, you guys have so much knowledge, so much expertise, right? And our greatest tool of learning happens actually when we're able to be in community. So even the framework in which I'm going to present, it's really cultivated with that in mind, right? Cultivated that our greatest impact happens when we can be in community, when we can have conversations that oftentimes aren't easy conversations, but we can have them with a degree of respect and humanity for each other. So for me, this slide was supposed to to kind of what do you call it? I'm blanking on the words, but it wasn't supposed to come all the way up at the same time, but it's there. So prison education is, right, and that's something that I often ask myself, like, what is prison education? And I think I really want to ask that of you too, because I feel before we can create a trauma-informed space, before we can create a space that actually allows us to, to do the work that we want to do in that space, we really have to be intentional with this question. And the things for me that come immediately to mind, and I'll bring more of that in when I speak about Paulo Freire and bell hooks, is that education is usually a tool for conformity, or it's a tool of liberation. And the two books that I'll speak about a little bit in maybe a few minutes are Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed and bell hooks Teaching to Transgress, which really grounds this. But prison education is also me. And for me, so much of my work, right, and let me go back to maybe the first two things before I speak about me. So much of my work, my understanding contemporary of these issues come from these two books, Paulo Freire's work and bell hooks' work. And I'm going to read this quote by Paulo Freire. And he says, there's no such thing as a neutral educational process. Education either functions as an instrument which is used to facilitate the integration of the younger generation into the logic of the present system and bring about conformity to it, or it becomes a practice of freedom. I remember reading that and just being like blown away, right? Just really thinking about, again, what is a purpose? Why are we like teaching education in prisons? I feel, for many of us, we will say immediately because, the men are deserving of it, the women are deserving of it, the people are deserving of it. But really, ultimately, what do we want that education to be? Do we want it to be an education that actually preaches conformity, or do we want it to be a liberatory education? And that's something that I would just love for you to sit with. And bell hooks speaks about the banking system of education. And it's really powerful, right? It's just rooted in the notion that all students have to do is just consume information. So if we just give folks information and they regurgitate it, we tell them that they're smart, right? And bell hooks says that's not education, right? That's conformity. Education is when we're able to create a space in which, we can show up. We can show up as authentic beings. We can show up and engage each other and don't necessarily have to agree, right? Because no one should be an active participant or a passive consumer, right? Education ultimately has to be a space where we can all show up authentically. And I understand, when we talk about prison education, that of course takes a different weight, right? So for me, again, so much of this work isn't just theoretical. It's also been my experience. My experience as a 18-year-old who was ultimately arrested and entrapped under what would be known as the Rockefeller drug laws. And for folks that aren't familiar with the Rockefeller drug laws, it's really the drug laws which created some of the most punitive sentences for people of color in the United States. And many people actually see the drug laws as a fuel for mass incarceration. So ultimately, I would serve 9 years in mostly adolescent jails and prisons. And in these spaces, again, thinking about like adolescence, right? It's probably was some of the darkest, some of the most violent places, right? And ultimately, I would be fortunate enough to have an experience where I would be transferred to probably one of the most infamous prisons in New York State called Attica. And in Attica, there happened to be a college program. And for folks that are familiar with the history of colleges and prisons, they know the 1995 crime bill actually eliminated college and prisons. And one of the things that it said, which is crazy as we know today, was that it created smarter criminals, and it didn't really have any other positive effect, right? And yet we know longitudinal research tells us that the greatest asset, for people leaving these spaces and actually having success is tied into a college degree. So much of even my own success comes from having this experience, right? Being able to actually earn an associate's degree in 2001. And where I was able to earn the degree was the Consortium of Niagara Frontier. And this was in many ways emblematic of the work that you do today and the work that, we have tried to really mold and enforce through Sustaining Futures. And maybe the language wasn't trauma, right? But it was such a human-centered approach. We did yoga classes, and this was, again, 2001, right? We were talking about meditation, we were talking about mindfulness, all things that we know are integral components to learning. And yet, we didn't have, quote unquote, this empirical data to substantiate it back then. This was just people, really people showing up and recognizing that our needs were probably a little bit different, right, than the folks that they would engage in a community, and try to create a structure that, probably wasn't the norm, right, but allowed us to really engage, rehumanize in ways that were necessary for us to actually learn. So again, the engagement was very human-centered. It was very critical. And I think this is a very important part of, education in prison settings, right? Like, how can you make sure that it's a critical engagement, right? Critical in a way that I often tell students, if I can forget everything that I'm saying, right? If I can help you to be more critical in the decisions you make and the way that you engage life, then that is a win. So I want to just really plant that here as well too, right? It's not just, again, a transference of information, but it's how do you really, create a space that allows folks to critically engage in a material. And a lot of that, for me, starts with our ability to really know your students beyond the number, right? So my number was 94A, 6325. Yet the professors that I had really had an opportunity to know us beyond the number, right? Really created space in the classrooms to understand how our lives maybe had connected to the issues that we were talking about, what our struggles were, but yet something else to it. And I think that, we always have to balance this, right? Because our greatest strength in these spaces is our humanity. Yet how do we maintain boundaries? Because this is also essential. And I know for many of you, in many of the trainings that we talked about, this had been a struggle, right? Like, how do I, show up as a human being? How do I acknowledge the immense trauma, the immense, harm that many of these folks have experienced and still, maintain my boundaries? But boundaries are essential, right? Boundaries are what allow us to kind of continue going into the space. And I think that's critical. And everyone respects that. I think from my point of view, right, I understood that if someone maybe crossed the line or crossed boundaries with me, even if they cared about me, I knew that would ultimately be dangerous for myself. I knew it would be ultimately dangerous for them, and I knew it would be ultimately dangerous for the program. So it was always important to, really find that balance, right? That balance in being able to show up and recognize and honor the humanity of the folks that are in your classes, but also to be able to maintain a set of boundaries which doesn't compromise the integrity of the work. And I think this is essential. So for me, when I think about educational praxis, right, and maybe I didn't even say what the word praxis was. Praxis to me, it's it's my favorite word, right? And it means really essentially, how do we move theory to practice? So I feel educational praxis is our ability to really look at theory, to really look at ways in which we can like evolve our educational standards, the way that we train, the way that we teach, right? And even when we talk about like trauma-informed education, that is an evolution of education, right? It's really studying what impedes our ability to learn and create in theory and ultimately action to do something else, right? So educational practice for me essentially like must unify, and this is a really good quote that I came across recently, and I feel like it really exemplifies, you know, the importance of us being in community, the importance of us having these really critical conversations. And it says, however much we're affected by the things of the world, however deeply they may stir and stimulate us, they become human for us only when we can discuss them with our fellows. We humanize what is going on in the world and in ourselves only by speaking of it. And in the course of speaking of it, we learn to be human. And the book was Men in Dark Times. And I thought that was so emblematic of the work that you do, right? It's like you're going into spaces that are ultimately, you know, dark spaces, and yet you are humanizing. You are bringing people together to have conversations, to think outside the box, to ultimately be free, even in a place that they're captive. So what I'm going to present is a framework to facilitate what I call educational praxis, right? And I present this framework usually by asking who's the greatest rapper. And this question is usually like so divisive, right? It does nothing to unify folks, but it's usually a good prelude into the question. And so for me, the framework is B.I.G, not the notorious B.I.G, but just B.I.G. And B.I.G, again, a framework for educational praxis. And B essentially is bias, right? And why would I talk about bias into going into my classrooms, right? So for me, like last year in particularly was one of the toughest classes that I ever taught. And the reason why it was so challenging was that everyone thought that they were right in relation to how they saw, view, experience oppression. And as a result, if anyone said anything contrary to that, we immediately moved to cancel them, right? So we created this very cancellation culture where no one felt safe having a conversation. No one felt safe really, you know, like doing the digging that is often required, you know, to have really critical pedagogy. So for me, I realized that so much of that really stems from, you know, our lack of awareness towards bias. So when I think of bias, right, and, you know, we talk a lot about bias today. Today's a day that we talk about a lot about bias, you know, cognitive biases. We talk about, what's the other one? Where we actually look for, you know, affirmation bias, right? So there's so much conversation today around bias. Yet for me, the question when I go into my classrooms, and a question that I often engage my class with is, how do you know what you know? You know, really simple question. How do you know what you know? And so much of this, again, comes from like really having a challenge in class, and then going back to bell hooks. And bell hooks says it's not a matter of like if, it's a matter of when, meaning like when your class is going to explode, right? When your class is going to feel tense, when there are going to be things that you are unable to maybe address in that moment, right? So for me, again, this conversation goes back to really pushing people to come into this space and really, you know, create a level of humility by asking yourself, how do we know what it is that we know? And for me as a social worker, that was something that was very, you know, important in our training. And we often talked about, you know, people in the environment, right? Meaning that the environment influenced behavior, behavior influenced a person, and vice versa. It created this reciprocal relationship, right? But nobody ever really stops to ask what influences the environment. And that was critical for me in my work, right? Especially in my work in trying to bridge, in trying to get people to come together and have conversations that oftentimes were not easy conversations. So ultimately, I think if we, ask ourselves, like, how do we know what we know? We'd come to the conclusion that, like, we all have bias. Our lens is biased, right? Like, we all see this world in relation to our, formal and informal education, right? So if we have that recognition, if we can all come to a place, and again, this is my check-in with all my classes, right? To really start at this place. How do we know what we know? And if we can have this recognition of bias, right, it then helps me to, really get to this next point, which I think is critical in creating grounding and really facilitating tough conversations. And Frantz Fanon, speaks about this idea of cognitive dissonance, right? And he says, sometimes people hold a core belief that is very strong. When they are presented with evidence that work against that belief, the new evidence cannot be accepted. It would create a feeling that is extremely uncomfortable, called cognitive dissonance. And because it is so important to protect the core belief, they often rationalize, ignore, and even deny anything that doesn't fit in with that core belief. So I take my classes, again, through bias, help them to understand, how do we know what we know, and help them to understand what happens when bias is challenged, right? When and I'll give them some really tangible examples of, arguments people usually have, some quote unquote common sense arguments, but let them understand that most of us, when our dominant viewpoints are challenged, it immediately, triggers cognitive dissonance. And cognitive dissonance for most of us is to reject. So once you're able to understand that, I really then ask this question, right? Like, what is your intention? And this may seem like, common sense, right? I'm in a classroom. Like, what do you mean, what is my intention? But it is not. It really is not. I mean, having taught in, like, probably institutions, like, throughout this world now, I realize that everyone is not there with that same intention. So it's important for me to really ask folks, are you here to learn? Are you here to grow? Or simply have beliefs, information reaffirmed, right? And towards the latter, that is where dissonance occurs the most, right? When your beliefs, the information that you already carry is not reaffirmed. So I really feel that an acknowledgement of bias and then really tuning into what is our intention while we are in this community. And for me, a tool that I use, I ask folks, what's your North Star? And for me, my North Star is like my mode of operation. My mode of operation, not only in academic spaces, right, but hopefully my mode of operation in all my spaces. And this is an example that I'll use, and it's for me. My North Star is I'm for truth, no matter who tells it. I'm for justice, no matter who it is for or against. I'm a human being, first and foremost, and as such, I'm forever, and I'm for whoever and whatever benefits humanity as a whole. And that was from Malcolm X. And I feel that is like a powerful North Star, right? Like, I'm for truth, I'm for justice, I'm for humanity, first and foremost, right? If that is my North Star, how does that then translate into my space? How does that, show up for me when I'm being challenged? How does that show up for me when someone shows me maybe a part of myself that I had not seen before? And this is critical, right? Because in classes, especially going back to the class I had last year, which I thought was so difficult, when it happens now, there's nothing to, when folks are, like wilding out, saying things that feel like really harmful towards each other, or, maybe in spaces where, they themselves are having a reaction, right? There's nothing to go back and hold as, hey, you know what? We talked about our North Stars being this. We talked about our intention being this. This doesn't feel aligned with our intention. There's no level of accountability. So I feel, clearly stating our intention in creating space together is very important. So then the G, so B, again, is bias, I is intention, and G then is grounding. And grounding to me is like rooted, right? And why does rooting feel necessary. It feels necessary to me because so many of us, right, are in spaces that have been harmful, ourselves. And we've talked a lot about like trauma, in our community of practice, and the implications of trauma even in our ability to show up, right? So this is something that I speak with and discuss with my class. You don't have to go as maybe intensive as, like we have gone, with this, but I really ask, folks to be mindful of, their ability to just actually show up, right? Are they taking care of themselves? To think about themselves as vessels, right? Because we know that if they don't have the capacity, if they don't have the space, then they're really not going to be able to, show up as a student. And this is even for ourselves, right? This isn't just as a student, but also for ourselves, as someone who, is a complex human being, right? Like we're not walking into that space as a sole, professor, right? Like professor is not our only title in life, right? Many of us are parents, many of us are caretakers, and have multiple jobs, positions, life issues, right? So really critical, again, that we start this work with ourselves, like, and this is for all of us to make that commitment to just know that, and this quote from Audre Lorde really says it, right? Caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare, right? Just really making sure that we understand that for us to show up and be in community with each other, it requires us to be attuned to our own levels of trauma. We spoke a lot about window of tolerance, et cetera, again, but just really recognizing that this work, ultimately, if we're going to create safe space, it really requires us to have space. And again, like trauma is drama. I would go through, most of some of the things that we have gone through together as a community, just helping my students to understand how trauma impacts our brains, how trauma impacts our bodies, and how that, again, like really just builds into like our community and, all aspects of our work. So again, if I start with myself, right, because then it's not just myself, right? Like I can say I'm going to show up and do the work, and I'm going to make sure that I'm cognizant of my trauma. I'm going to be cognizant of my window of tolerance. I'm going to be, resilient focused. But yet, this work never happens, in a silo. It never happens, we're talking about, classes, right, and community education. So it really begins to then ask not only of ourselves, but acts of each other. Like, what do we need to ground in brave space? And I use this word brave space, right, because I think it sets the tone that, oftentimes we say safe space, and safe is such a relative term, right? What is safe for me may not be safe for you. And so I use this word brave space because it allows us to really, like, acts of each other. What do we need? Like, what do we need? Rather than assuming, and I think so much harm happens when we assume that this is good and this is bad and this is safe and this is not, right? So just to be intentional to acts of each other, what do we need to be in brave space? And again, to like pivot back to, bell hooks, and I hope folks really, read those books, Teaching to Transgress by bell hooks and Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Because bell hooks says, again, education is going to be difficult, right? Like if we really show up and have education that's transformative, that is empowering, that is humanizing, it's going to be difficult work. Again, even just pivoting back to dissonance, right? Like again, we're all coming in with bias. Dissonance in itself is going to be challenging, right? So really just asking of each other, especially if our intention is to create this, then asking of each other what we require to be in brave space. And for me, I call it ground rules, right? And this is an example of what some of my classes have created in the past. And, it's really great handwriting. That's why I took a picture of it and I use it in these slides. But to really create a living document, right? And what I mean by that is to really, as a community, say, we're going to be together for the next 15 weeks, right? You are going to be experiencing things in your family. You're going to be experiencing things in the prison. I'm going to be experiencing things, coming into the prison. I'm going to be experiencing things in my life, right? When we come together, what is going to be our ground rules, irrespective of what is happening? And I think this also ties into the idea of boundaries, what we talk about, right? Like a way, how do I get to know you, but how do I also like create boundaries, right? And so for me, the ground rules are essential. I feel like if we don't have ground rules, it's a Wild West, meaning that we're operating from everyone else's perspective, right? It's like what I believe is right, what you believe is right, but not what we collectively believe is right. So if we look at this, you see some of the things that folks have spoke about, vulnerability, honesty, as prerequisites of the class, right? Like respect, listen, respond, empathy. This is really big for me, calling people in rather than calling people out, right? And I often, I remember recently, and it happened actually in the educational space, and I think I spoke about this during Sustaining Futures, was I used the word dropout a lot. And we were doing one of these things where we socially contracted, and someone paused and said, could I kind of like really respond to that? And responded to it in such a way that helped me to understand, why dropout was a bad term, right? That I immediately saw the knowledge, saw the wisdom, and was able to shift, my language. And the term that they put forward was push out. And push out really speaks to, the systemic challenges that someone often experiences before they actually get to a point where they leave school, right? Where dropout solely implies that, someone just, internally made a decision not to go back to school. So that was a powerful experience for me in someone calling me in versus calling me out. And even if you think about that in just, again, like how many times when we are wrong, we know we're wrong, right? But it's all about the engagement, right? So for me, again, I think of my great-grandmother who always used to say that you get more with honey than you get with vinegar. So calling people in for me is honey. We should also be mindful about language, and language is so important. And I remember a mentor, Eddie Ellis, speaking about, language in relation to formerly incarcerated people or incarcerated people. And, he was someone who was a pioneer in this work. And one of the things he recognized was just that if we use language like ex-con, parolees, convicts, we were often missing, just the truth that these were fathers, these were mothers, these were brothers, these were sisters. And it didn't allow us then the same level of engagement. It didn't allow us the same level of just humanity, right? So just, like as a group, let's be mindful of our language. Let's be mindful in showing up and participating authentically. Let's ask questions. Let's have restorative conversations, assume good intentions, be aware of bias, have compassion, support others. So again, this is a really great example, and I left this up a little bit longer than most of my slides because I think that this is it, right? Like ways in which we can be intentional in how we show up in space is the most important thing. And I feel like by creating ground rules, it allows us to, again, just really take in consideration what all our needs are. And the last thing I want to say about this is that it has to be a living document, co-created living document, almost like what our Constitution was supposed to be. And I want to read this really quote by Thomas Jefferson, which just kind of highlights that. And he says, laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. As that becomes more developed, more enlightened, as new discoveries are made, new truths discovered, and manners and opinions change with the change of circumstances, institutions must advance also and keep pace with the times. We might as well require a man to wear still the coat which fitted him when a boy, as civilized society, to remain ever under the regiment of their barbarous ancestors. And again, this is really, I love the, the jacket analogy, right? Because, throughout a period of a class, in week 5, week 6, you're going to see things that may be different, right? Week 7, week 8, you might see something else again. And you might have to say, like, hey, can we come back to our ground rules? Can we come back to this document? Because I'm seeing things that I feel like would be really important for us to check in on there. So these are some maybe key points I want to just really highlight with you. Educational praxis for me then is it's intentional, right? And again, praxis is taking what we know from theory and putting it to action. So I think it has to be intentional, right? Like we can't just show up into space and not really be intentional into why we're in space. It has to be critical, right? We really have to not just transfer information as much as we should be really being even critical of the things, the lessons, the knowledge that it is that we're even presented. It has to be healing and trauma informed, right? And I think we've spoken so much about healing and trauma that I'm going to just let that go. But it has to be healing and trauma informed. And it has to be rooted in shared, evolved, and ground rules. And I think I said a lot about that. But again, it has to be shared and it has to be evolved in. And it also has to be community learning. This again, so much of this work happens in community, right? We can't think that, we can just transfer information and that's beneficial, right? We really have to make sure that we're facilitating a community that has the ability to hold space, that has the ability to really push our collective learning. And even one of the other things I want to say about community, right, is when we talk about managing and holding classrooms, you cannot do that by yourself. I think about how much I've struggled in trying to hold a classroom myself, and it's impossible. It has to be a lift, going back to, the bell hooks, it has to be a labor in which we all participate in. So the more that we can really empower our classes to be a part of that, to see value in that, to see themselves in that process, is the easier it is to do. So I thought of 3 things, 3 segment areas where we can, think a little bit more intentionally around, think a little bit more around bias and thinking about how we can do more grounding. And the first one is obviously syllabus, right? So to really go back to your content, to really, be critical with your content, to really ask, what does it communicate? What does your content communicate? What are the potential triggers? This is important. And I think for many folks that are on campus, that have folks that are coming home from, these spaces and are now part of the campus community, I think it would be really important to convene, working groups, right? That at the end of each semester, that actually allows, an evolution of your syllabus to have, folks who have had these experiences. Maybe it's folks that have been in your classes. Maybe it's folks that just are formerly incarcerated, to go through your syllabus with them and ask them, what does this feel like for you? What do you think when you hear this? I think that would be a really great way to really, again, look at your syllabus and think about how it translates into that space. And to really, again, look at feedback points. Where are you getting feedback for your syllabus? Not only, I think oftentimes we wait till the end of a semester to really get feedback, and how can we do that sooner? And so for me, some of the things that I do in my classes, I will do check-ins, and the check-ins are usually grounded in just how folks are doing. But I also ask them, to just check in on the syllabus, check in on, the stuff that we've covered. What, maybe last week was a really challenging lesson, right? Let's talk about that. But to really look again at where your feedback points in your syllabus. And I would just advise, don't wait till the end. Maybe set up 3, 4 very intentional points in your semester where you can just sit and really build on what has happened thus far. For pedagogy, the thing that comes to mind for me is, how does learning happen, right? And going back to, many of us come from, again, banking systems of education, where we've had professors just essentially stand in front of a classroom and lecture for 45 minutes or 2 hours or 3 hours, and you just regurgitate that information. But really, we should not be doing that, right? And I never want to tell somebody how to teach a class, but I think that we have enough empirical data to say like learning is a lot more dynamic process, right? So, and this is also going to be content specific, so I'm respectful of that, but to really just be as imaginative as possible in terms of how the learning happens. For me, some of the things that I do is like I try to have my classes do as many group presentations of the information. So I will have them maybe, from week 7, every week there's a group presentation where they are actually the ones presenting the content. I ask them to present the content. I ask them to create questions to engage the class in the content. And I ask them also to critique the content. So just really, again, thinking about how pedagogy happens, ways in which it can become more dynamic. And again, just creating regular check-ins with your class in terms of like what's happening. And ultimately, again, it has to be collaborative. And also make it critical, right? Like really, and that ties into B.I.G. B.I.G is really a point that allows you, a framework that allows you to create those critical conversations in your classrooms, because I know that that is a point of contention for people, right? I don't want to activate people. I don't want to, maybe push people in ways that may be uncomfortable. But again, when you create, a co-learning environment, it actually allows it to be pretty critical in a very organic way. And, and ground rules are things, again, that allows you to facilitate that process. This is a piece that I feel is, it's so cumbersome, right? Like last week I was doing a training on anti-oppressive practice, and it was in a room with no windows, and I'm like, how are we going to do a training that requires people to really sit with some deep and heavy stuff? And it felt like we had them in solitary confinement in a basement. Like by the time they left there, they were probably like, so done with it, right? So space, I understand that we're in a prison. I understand that, we won't have, a lot of autonomy around this. So I say that with this knowledge, right? But, for me, so many of my classes happen in circles. It's a way of, I think about a lot of this content, and we're often delivering content where, people aren't even seeing each other, right? So like I'm talking to the back of your head for the entire semester. And I understand that this is, again, probably what it looks like in a lot of your spaces. But if you can somehow facilitate a circle, if you can somehow, Tony speaks a lot about U formations, right? If you can somehow, be critical or have power to shape your space, by all accounts, like please do that, right? And I think it would also be really good for folks that, have been creative in this process, right? Because again, I understand that each prison is going to have their own norm, their own culture, but I know folks have been really creative in how they even mitigate that. So I think it would be really important for folks to just share how they have often mitigated the idea of space in those spaces. And the thing about community, this is something that I wanted to speak about earlier, right? So I spoke a lot about community inside, but really think about how you can create community outside. And I think so much of that can happen, through informal ways. So I remember teaching a class in Sing Sing, and a lot of what we did was we had, for maybe the 5 of us that were teaching in a program, we created a WhatsApp group, and like literally would just, literally leave and send each other messages. Sometimes the messages were fun, sometimes they were heavy, sometimes they were support. But just really think about ways in which you can foster community, because I understand that folks, are challenged in meeting every week or meeting every 2 weeks. But I think ultimately, again, this space requires us to be in community, not only in the classroom, but really community amongst our colleagues and peers. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you for listening to me talk for an hour and 15 minutes. I hope that, I was able to really share things that had value. And I look forward to just, let's engage in some questions, some thoughts, some feedback, some comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay, for that presentation. So I know we have a couple of participants on the line, and we're given this really rich and informative webinar. Feel free to chat in your questions to all participants. In the meanwhile, Jay, would you mind going to the next slide? I can just quickly review our next steps. So while we wait for your questions, I just want to quickly touch upon the next steps for this project. Next week, we'll be scheduling an email with your group consultation calls. This is an exciting opportunity to collaborate and hear how other CITs are addressing their selected ODG goal areas in innovative ways. We'll also have another webinar on September 6th with the topic to be determined. And we've also set the date for our final in-person convening for September 27th to 29th. As we move closer to the event, we'll share details around our planned activities as well as the expectations for your CIT during the event. And we'll wait for your next questions.
So this is Kelly, and I'll just chime in while folks are kind of coming up with questions to ask. Jay, do you have like an example syllabus that exemplifies a lot of the qualities that you spoke about on this webinar that you would maybe be willing to share with the group? I just wonder if seeing some of the concepts that you talked about in practice on a document.
Yeah, absolutely. I can totally share like assignments, how I construct assignments, as well as the language. I try to use a lot of language even in my syllabus that speaks to the idea of community and speaks to, expectations in relation to some of, things that are attributed in B.I.G. So absolutely.
That's great. And if you want to send to me, I'm happy to help distribute to the community at large.
Awesome. I'm so happy that I was able to leave people speechless.
Yeah, I think we're receiving a lot of comments saying that they're really excited about this presentation.
I'm happy.
Yeah, I know you touched upon anti-oppressive practice in your presentation. I was wondering if you could just give us a brief description of what that is.
Well, I ultimately feel that so many of, folks that are doing this work in prisons, it's just that, right? It's anti-oppressive practice. It's really, I think ultimately, if I could succinctly say what anti-oppressive practice is, it's like recognizing the value of all humanity and really empowering their ability to self-actualize, right? And how, going into a prison when you have a society that tells you that, these people are not people and are often not deserving, and yet recognizing the power that you bring into that space and your ability, myself, right? Prime example, the light that you bring into such a dark space and the ability of that to really empower, I think that is anti-oppressive practice at its core, right? I don't think I need to say any type of theoretical explanation. I think that is it.
Well, thank you.
This is Tony. Did you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. I have a question for Jay. One of the most difficult times for any faculty is the first day, and the first time you're going to go into that prison. Even if you've done it before, right? You're going to see a whole new set of students, and if you're new to it, it can be pretty scary. And so I know that the semester will be starting, I guess, in September. On some of the calls that I've been on, there are going to be considerably new faculty who are going to be joining. So, what might you say? What kind of advice or suggestions would you have for that faculty who's going in for their very first contact with those students, and what you think would be very helpful in terms of reflecting some of these principles that you've been discussing?
Yeah, no, great question. I mean, I think the first thing is just really like be yourself, right? And and maybe I say that like in terms of don't be anybody but you, right? Like just really honor who you are. As I think in those spaces, that's folks they respect that a lot, right? They respect when people can come in and just honestly like be people. I think the second part of your question, Tony, how you can then incorporate this. So for me, this is literally very like my first day is essentially all this, right? I really begin by asking folks, why are you here? Like, what do you believe is the purpose of education, right? And I think that is something that we often take for granted. Just really pausing to ask folks, like, why are you here? Like, what is your expectations? Then that allows me to really go into, like, again, like, how do we know what we know, right? When I can ask someone to really begin to question that, like, even have a critical analysis of themselves, it allows me to then introduce, like, B.I.G. It allows me to then speak towards bias. It allows me to then say, if we understand that we have bias, right? And I'll do a lot of things with them that are more relatable, that are more fun. I'll say, for examples around bias, I'll say, why are you a Giants fan, right? Like, or why are you a Knicks fan, right? And to show, again, like how our knowledge base or the things that we give value are constructed based on proximity. And, these are light but fun exercises that actually help them to think really critically. And with that introduction to bias, and I guess you can make this very relatable to whatever you feel comfortable towards, it then allows me easily to transition into like an intention, to really ask folks to be intentional in like why we're going to be here, what we're going to be, what we're going to do over the next, 15 weeks, whatever it may be. And then that allows me to really then like transition to the ground rules.
Okay. Thank you.
Absolutely.
So I don't think we've received any other questions. And with that, I think we can close the webinar. We'll definitely work on providing a sample syllabus to distribute to all of you, and you can look forward to the recording and the slides in the next few days. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to myself, Kelly, or Meg, and have a great rest of your day.